Hey, and welcome to another Ask Me Anything video cast where I, Chris Clemens, try to answer your political questions. Today has to do with gun policy yet again. So I am doing another gun video. Last time I went on ahead and did some comparative statistics in terms of what other countries are doing, how they're actually affecting the homicide rates in those countries, and tried to give the overall idea or the opinion that there is no correlation between homicide rates in other countries and differing gun policies. This episode is going to really dig into the real statistics deeply, so expect a lot of different blurbs and stuff to be popping up on your screen. Absolutely every single statistic that I use today is going to be posted on my resource page in my website. So if you actually go up to clemensforkansas.com and you go up to the resources page, there is a PDF file posted up there that basically shows you absolutely everywhere I got all of this information. I'm using the FBI crime database, I'm using World Health Org, World Bank, a bunch of different sources to bring this to bear, so you guys can actually see what the real data says about homicides in America, about mass shootings in America, and other countries. So actually getting into the data, let's take a look. So currently the United States homicide rates for 2016, which is what I actually have the data for right now, the information is this. We have seen a small increase in the number of homicides in the United States as from our lows, our historical lows in 2014. So most people don't realize that in 2014 and 2013, we reached the lowest point of homicide in our country in over 50 years. So we have seen a drastic decrease in overall homicides since the 1980s. And the trends that we see here in the United States mirror the same trends as Australia, as Canada, as Japan. All of the different countries that are typically used as exemplars of gun policy saw the same style of decrease in homicides since the 1980s, and yet here in the United States, we've loosened our gun laws, not strengthened them in that time period. So let's actually kind of look at where are most homicides actually, how are they being committed? Well, when you get into the total number of homicides, which was 15,070 according to the FBI in 2016, of those homicides, a total of 11,004 were committed by firearm. Of those 11,004, 7,105 of them were committed using a handgun. 374 of them were committed using rifles, 262 using shotguns, and there was 3,000 homicides that were not specified as to what firearm was used. However, based on the data, you can basically assume that handguns were used in those instances. Knives and cutting instruments were used in 1,604 homicides in 2016, which, if you were paying attention to the actual data, is something like 6 times more than rifles combined. So if you actually look at rifles of being 374 homicides committed by those in 2016, 1,600 is a much bigger number. Blunt objects were used in 472 homicides, still more than rifles. Personal weapons, which basically means your hands and fists, that was 656, so twice the amount that of homicides were committed essentially by bludgeoning people to death with hands and knees and so on and so forth than rifles. I keep bringing up the word rifle for a reason. What I've seen a lot of people do is propose that we need to reissue the assault weapons ban on rifles in the United States in order to try and curb the number of homicides occurring in the United States. However, rifles make up less than 2% of all homicides committed in the United States. And in fact, when we look at mass shootings have been mostly occurred with handguns being the main weapon of choice. Handguns were used in 2/3 of all mass shootings since 1982, and rifles have been used in 1/3 of mass shootings since 1982. In fact, rifles were the sole weapon used in only 11% of mass shootings since 1982. So when we start talking about public policy and how we can get our heads around the violence and things of that nature, an assault weapons ban would basically do absolutely nothing to stem the tide of homicides or mass shootings in our nation. So the people who are proposing these policies have not actually taken a look at the FBI data, and they have not taken a look at the Mother Jones data set, which has been posted for 3 or 4 years now online and is continuously updated every time there's a mass shooting event. Now, I need to clarify, the mass shooting events that Mother Jones discusses, or how they classify or define a mass shooting, is a single shooter event who is essentially coming into a crowd of people and indiscriminately killing individuals. So not your, more than 4 individuals involved in a shooting, which generally involves gang shootings. It's not what the majority of the public actually thinks of when they think of mass shootings. So Mother Jones has a very, I would say, widely accepted definition and what they mean by mass shootings. Now, if we go into the mass shooting data, which is what I'm pulling up here right now, in terms of mass shootings, how many homicides in the United States are attributed to mass shootings? Well, when you actually look at the numbers, in 2016, less than half of 1% of all homicides came from mass shootings. So the actual real number is 0.47% of homicides in 2016 came from mass shootings. In fact, if you go further back, you look at 2015, 2014, the number of homicides that were attributed to mass shootings was 0.14%. So while I understand mass shootings are atrocious acts and we don't want them to occur in our schools, when we are actually realistically talking about this issue, we're talking about a very, very, very tiny number of individuals who are affected by those acts. And what we really, if we're looking to actually find policies that are going to bring down homicides overall, focusing on mass shootings really isn't the way to go. Now, again, I'm not discounting those who have passed, have died at the hands of these insane individuals. And I do agree, we have seen an overall increase in the number of mass shootings and the number of homicides committed in those. However, we're still talking about a fraction of a percent of the overall number of homicides. So if we're really looking to try and reduce the number of murders in the United States, going after the mass shooting angle or aspect of it is going to have a very small impact in the overall amount of violence in our country. I guess it's the best way to sum that up. So let's go on ahead and take a look, start talking about where most of these shootings, most of these homicides are occurring. If you actually look into the data, over half of all homicides committed in the United States are occurring in 2% of this nation's counties. So generally what that means is more than half of all homicides are basically being committed inside of our major cities. Chicago, Kansas City, New York, so on and so forth. The large cities in our nation, this is where the homicides are being committed. And when you get into the data even further, you'll notice that most of them are attributed to gang violence. Now, the question becomes, well, how do we stem the tide of gang violence? And there's a lot of solutions for that. So when I'm talking in this video, I'm going to start talking about, well, what can we actually do to try and fix these issues? There's 300 million guns in the United States and 320 million people. There's almost a gun for every individual. There's absolutely no possible way we can keep firearms out of the hands of criminals. That's one thing to mention. Think about how easy it is for people to get drugs in this country, and yet we have banned marijuana and cocaine and methamphetamine and all these opioids that are on the market now in the black market. We've basically been able to do absolutely nothing to keep those out of people's hands. Cannabis is one of those that's a very good example in that, not only is cannabis not really that harmful, but since we've made it made it illegal, we've created this massive black market, and for the most part, more than half of the country have at least tried cannabis at one point in time. So the point of the matter is, simply making something illegal is not going to eliminate it off the black market. And if we start trying to ban firearms, when there's so many, they're so prolific in our country, we're really only going to be taking the firearms away from law-abiding citizens. So how do we start trying to reduce the overall amount of homicides? Well, one solution is to end the drug war. I mentioned that most of the homicides that are occurring in these major cities are due to gang violence, or theft and crime of like armed robbery and things like that. Well, how do we solve that problem? Ending the drug war will start to get we can start to see some reduction in violence. And why do I say that? Well, why do people in gangs generally kill people from other gangs or other drug cartels, so on and so forth? It's because they are fighting for distribution territory in those cities. You'll know if you live in those cities, especially in those areas where the crime is high, that is the main reason why these neighborhoods are getting shot up, is because we have rival gangs. Those rival gangs are slinging drugs on the streets, and that is interfering with the bottom line of whoever controls that territory. So there is an economic cause behind a lot of these homicides that are occurring in the major cities. Now, other things that would lead to violence due to the drug war has to do with the fact that, well, these are a lot of times nonviolent offenders are being put in prison for things like possession or possession with the intent to distribute, so on and so forth. And when they come out of prison, they no longer have the ability generally to get a good job. Ex-cons have a very, very difficult time of actually obtaining real employment in our nation. So generally when they get out, they go right back into the same activities that got them there in the first place, only this time they've now served a stint in prison. Generally they're more hardened criminals, and they're more willing to do the violent acts that go along with the distribution of narcotics. On top of that, when we start taking we start breaking apart the core family unit of these inner cities, and we start having these children simply being raised by single mothers, overall those values and discipline and the lack of having an actual real role model in the home has a real major effect on how kids grow up and how they view the world, how they view crime, how they view gang relationships. And we get this vicious cycle where we have these young people coming up with very little hope. They have very little discipline. They don't pay attention in school because, again, they don't have that role model at home telling them, hey, you need to be in school, you need to keep your nose clean, so on and so forth, listen to your teachers, do your homework. All that stuff is thrown out the window. So then we have these kids who are graduating or dropping out of school. They have no skills. And overall, they feel isolated in their community. They don't feel like they belong to society in general, so they turn to these gangs to give them that sense of brotherhood and those role models that they're seeking out. Young men especially are looking for role models. And this is something that I see in Rosedale, not a lot, but I still see quite a bit of it. As a matter of fact, I just watched one of my students get carted away today on a possession charge, possession with intent to distribute, within our own building. And that is something that just, because of the drug war, because we've made these substances like cannabis, which is completely harmless, illegal, we've created this black market, and those who are willing to, run the risk of being put in jail, well, they fill those gaps. And who are the people who are generally willing to be put in jail? Well, it's those people who are low-skilled, who don't have a lot of hope to participate in our economy, and they see an economic opportunity that they are willing to take the risks to fill in. So trying to get rid of the drug war and trying to repair the core family unit in the inner cities is one of the easy ways that we can start to see a reduction in violence. And when I speak to building relationships and having positive role models for a lot of these students, it does make a real big impact. For example, I'll take the school that I teach at now. Just 20 years ago, the violence that was occurring at Rosedale Middle School, Rosedale High School, was actually rather high. There were bathrooms were set on fire on a regular basis. Fights were happening every day or every other day. There was, real gang-affiliated activity occurring in the schools, gang fights, so on and so forth. And the way that the Rosedale community started to turn the tide against those things is by building positive relationships with their students. Now, there's still an emphasis put on test scores, but that emphasis, thankfully, because of the administration that we've had over the years, that emphasis has kind of been put on the back burner, and we have mostly focused on trying to build relationships with students, trying to understand where they're coming from, trying to provide them with grace within the classroom, and really overall making them feel valued and wanted. And that's one of those things that a lot of people tend to discount. There's a lot of people on the right and on the left that will sit there and say, well, these kids need to learn how to pick themselves up by their bootstraps and so on and so forth. But when you don't have a pair of boots to pick yourself up by the bootstraps with, it becomes very hard to see your way out of these bad situations. And speaking to the student who was arrested today, this is one of those students who I have counseled multiple times and I've talked with, and I've asked, hey, I've actually talked to him. He's a very bright kid. He's very smart. He has a lot of potential. And his parents have told him multiple times that they don't love him. They wish he had never been born. They believe that he has no future ahead of him, and he has found his way into a local gang who tells him the exact opposite. It gives him that sense of purpose and that sense of brotherhood, and he's latched onto that. And I've had conversations trying to convince him that he has potential to do better things. And the one thing I constantly hear about is that people don't care about him, people don't love him, he's too stupid, he can't do this or that or this. And the fact of the matter is, that's where those real relationships come in. When kids lose hope, that's when they turn to violence, that's when they turn to gangs, that's when they turn to nefarious activities. So, building relationships and focusing on that and not test scores. Because, see, that seems to be the one thing that we want to do in our nation right now is really go into these inner cities and push this idea that, we can get test scores up with all the other schools and so on and so forth without having any understanding of where our students are coming from. And, we talk about these mass shooting situations and we talk about violence at schools, and generally what are we seeing? It's generally those students who feel isolated, who feel downtrodden, who feel like nobody cares about them or loves them, that are the ones who go off the rails and commit these acts of violence. We have to start taking a look at real psychology, human psychology, to try and turn the tide on these events. Now, the other half of the homicides that are occurring are not occurring just in our inner cities, they're abroad. So what are some of the ways that we can actually stem the tide on that? How can we reduce homicides overall in our nation? Well, it comes down to community. And this is something that people don't want to hear. They want to hear that there's a governmental solution, that we can come in and we can apply force in this manner and it's going to solve our problem. Easy peasy, we don't have to think about it. In fact, the average American doesn't have to do anything about it. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at the way we interact with each other on a day-to-day basis, especially since the invention of the internet and the invention of social media, we have lost real personal connection with our friends, with our individuals who we hold dear or used to hold dear. And for the most part, what has been replaced is this superficial relationship where we go on Facebook or Twitter, we kind of get an idea of what so-and-so is doing, but we don't have those real personal, intimate connections with people anymore. And when we start taking a look at the people who commit homicides or mass murder events and so on and so forth, again, to go back to that theme, these people generally are very angry, very depressed. They, overall feel like they have lost connections or purpose in the world. And that's another thing to mention. People feel, or at least a lot of the people who commit these homicides, feel a loss of overall purpose. And that loss of purpose, that loss of meaning in someone's life generally tends to lead them down a depressive or highly, irate sense of mind. They're ready to snap at any point. They stop seeing each other as human beings. And overall, I've seen this in my lifetime when we have stopped seeing people as human beings and we start looking at people like numbers. So how do we start stemming the tide of the violence that's occurring outside of our major cities? Well, it's as simple as trying to reconnect with individuals on a personal level, as well as ensuring people have work, real meaningful work, things that mean a lot to them. When you take a look at addiction statistics, you will notice that about half of the country is addicted to some substance or is self-medicating to try and mitigate these negative feelings. When you look at alcohol addiction rates, you look at opioid addiction rates, you look at the fact that, 8 times more people are killed due to alcohol-related deaths every year than are killed via homicides overall. Not just with weapons, with guns, but overall, 8 times more people are killed every year. 88,000 were killed in 2016 from alcohol-related deaths. This is a symptom of the fact that we have a sick society and people are overall unhappy. We continue to talk about these superficial things that should be making people happy. Maybe, all you need is a big screen TV and you need this car here and you need this and this and this and this is what's going to make you happy. And we have lost what is really, truly meaningful in our lives as a culture. And that is having a real effect on people's mental state. When I say more than half of the populace is addicted or is self-medicating themselves to mitigate these feelings, I'm not just talking about drugs overall. Food is a big one. People overeat and they overdrink sweet, sugary drinks and things of that nature for the feeling, the good, positive feeling, the release of serotonin and the other positive, mental neurochemicals that bring them that feeling of satisfaction and overall happiness. This is why Americans are so fat. This is why we're addicted to these substances, so on and so forth. We're trying to feel good because overall our culture is not making us feel good. The jobs that we go to, these jobs where we're filing paperwork and we're doing things that are overall we recognize at a deep level are not fulfilling us, is causing our society to be sick. And again, because we've lost those personal connections, there's no one there to provide that overall sense of perspective of what reality really is. People want to, we have evolved to be social creatures. We have evolved to have small family units or small, villages or communities where we are all in some way, shape, or form have a deep purpose within that community. We all contribute to that community. But so many people today simply come home in their big neighborhoods, they open the garage, they park their car, and they never even say hi to their neighbors. This is not something that has been ongoing for a long period in time. This is actually something that's very relatively recent in human history where we've lost that personal connection. And again, this is one of those things that people who, on the left and on the right, they want to know that, hey, there's a governmental policy. We can put this in place and we're going to solve this problem. But the fact of the matter is, folks, the responsibility starts with you at home. It starts with you actually reaching out to those individuals around you and starting to reconnect with people. Because when we have a larger sense of community, when we have a healthier society overall, a mentally healthier society overall, those homicides start to go down. And that's what you actually really see when you start looking at these other cultures who have historically low homicide rates. These are real communities, countries that are based on, on communalism and the idea that everyone has a real part or purpose in that community. Take a look at those Northern European countries. They're some of the nicest people you'll ever get to meet. They're some of the most welcoming people you will ever get to meet. Of course they have a historically low homicide rate. These are things we have to take a look at. What is our culture producing? So while I understand, again, that this isn't one of those videos that people are going to take away, some new policy decision that's going to get us, moving in the right direction, it is something that we need to start considering. Yes, ending the drug war will have a massive effect on violence in our country. There's no doubt about that in my mind. And you can look up all of the different estimates online and take a look at the real research behind the violence that's behind the drug war. But we saw the exact same thing during the Prohibition era with alcohol. That's where all the mafias got their money, right? That's where they got their start. Those organized crime industries got their start due to black markets that were created by our governments. And we need to end those black markets and regulate those things, bring them out of the dark and into the public, into the real economy, so that those black markets and the violence that generally tends to stem from around them does not occur. So hopefully I've done a good job of trying to explain myself in this video. I know this is a long form video, but I think it's really kind of necessary to spell a lot of these things out. One more anecdote I want to throw in here before I go on ahead and end this particular video has to do with homicide rates in Kansas. So a lot of people, again, are talking about trying to ban rifles. They're talking about banning semi-automatic weapons, so on and so forth, to try and actually get some sort of a turnaround on the homicide rates. But if you actually take a look at Kansas overall, and you take a look at our homicide rates, and you take a look at our gun policy, in 2006, Kansas started rolling back a lot of its gun regulations. In fact, 2006 marked the day where Kansans could start carrying concealed weapons with a permit. Now, since then, we have passed several other laws basically deregulating the ownership of firearms. In fact, I believe it was 2015 where we essentially opened up concealed carry, constitutional carry, for anyone in Kansas who does not need a concealed carry permit any longer. If you actually take a look at Kansas's homicide rates, they have basically been flat since that time period. There has been absolutely no change, both positive or negative. So when we start talking about gun policy and restricting the ownership of guns, well, that right there flies in the face of that argument. The fact of the matter is, this deregulation has had no impact whatsoever on the crime rate in Kansas. And if you actually take a look at the overall crime rate in the United States, again, as I said before, it has been in a steady decrease since the 1980s, despite the fact that most states in the Union have rolled back their gun restrictions overall. So when we start talking about gun policy and what to do, the fact of the matter is, there is no correlation. And I need to drive that part home. There is absolutely no correlation between either the reduction in regulation or the addition of regulation on firearms and the homicide rate. They basically have nothing to do with each other. It's those societal issues that I mentioned before that have the real impact, and that's where we need to be focusing our attention as a nation, as a culture, and as a community. So with that, I hope I've done a good job of trying to sum this particular issue up. If you like this video or you want to know more about what I have to say on this particular issue, send me an email, send me a message on Facebook, tweet me out at Chris_Clemens. You can look me up on Facebook, Chris Clemens for U.S. Congress, or you can check out my website. I have a contact section up there on my website. It's clemensforkansas.com. There's also a donate button. If you go to contribute on my website, you will see on the transparency and contribution page, there is a button for you to click. Right now that will take you to GoFundMe. I'm trying to raise $2,000 before a convention on April 20th, and that would absolutely be really helpful if I could reach those goals. And the last thing I will say before I sign off here is, don't forget, the biggest thing you could do for my campaign right now is share my posts, like my posts, retweet, watch my YouTube videos, subscribe to my YouTube channel. All of those things help my visibility overall. The more people who see my name and see my message, the more support I gain overall. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.